Imagine walking through the streets of Boston on a cold winter afternoon. The air smells faintly sweet, almost like caramel. Children are playing outside. Workers are heading home after another long day. Nothing feels unusual. Then, without warning, the ground begins to shake. A deep rumble echoes through the neighborhood. People stop and look around, confused. Seconds later, an enormous steel tank explodes, sending millions of gallons of thick, dark molasses racing through the streets like a tidal wave. It sounds impossible, but on January 15th, 1919, that is exactly what happened. This is the unbelievable true story of the Great Molasses Flood, one of the strangest and most forgotten disasters in American history. To understand how such an unusual disaster became possible, we have to travel back to Boston more than 100 years ago. The year was 1919. World War I had just ended. America was changing rapidly. Factories were working around the clock, industries were expanding, and Boston was one of the country's busiest commercial cities. Its busy harbor connected New England to the rest of the world. Ships arrived every week carrying valuable cargo from the Caribbean. One of the most important products was molasses. Today, molasses is mostly known as a sweet syrup used in baking. But in the early 20th century, it was far more valuable. It was used to manufacture industrial alcohol, which was needed for explosives, chemicals, medicines, and many other products. Demand was incredibly high. To store these enormous shipments, the United States Industrial Alcohol Company built a gigantic steel storage tank in Boston's North End. The tank stood nearly 50 feet tall and could hold more than 2 million gallons of molasses. From a distance, it looked almost like a giant water tower. Most people barely noticed it. It had become part of the neighborhood. Children played nearby every day. Families walked past it on their way to work or school. Horse-drawn wagons rolled beneath its shadow without a second thought. But not everyone trusted the massive structure. Even before the disaster, local residents had noticed something strange. The tank often leaked. Dark brown molasses slowly dripped through tiny cracks in the steel walls. Children sometimes collected the dripping syrup in small cans. For them, it was almost like a free treat. But adults were less amused. Some neighbors complained that the tank groaned loudly as it filled. Others said they could hear strange metallic popping sounds coming from inside. Instead of investigating the complaints, the company simply painted the tank brown. The fresh coat of paint helped hide the leaks. From the outside, everything appeared perfectly normal. Inside, however, enormous pressure continued building. In January 1919, a fresh shipment of warm molasses arrived from the Caribbean. Thousands of tons of syrup were pumped into the already massive tank. At the same time, Boston experienced an unusual rise in temperature after days of freezing weather. Few people realized that these changing conditions would soon place even greater stress on the steel walls. On the afternoon of January 15th, workers and residents carried on with their daily routines. No one knew that only moments remained before one of the most unusual disasters in American history would suddenly burst into life. And when it did, Boston would never forget the sound. The afternoon of January 15th, 1919, seemed completely ordinary. Workers continued their jobs. Children played in the streets. Horse-drawn wagons rolled through Boston's North End as they had countless times before. No one looked twice at the giant steel tank towering above the neighborhood. Then, at approximately 12:40 p.m., a loud metallic groan echoed through the air. For a brief moment, everything stood still. People turned toward the sound, trying to understand where it had come from. Seconds later, the impossible happened. With a thunderous roar, the massive steel tank suddenly burst apart. Steel plates weighing hundreds of pounds were ripped from the structure and hurled through the air like giant pieces of shrapnel. The force of the explosion could be heard blocks away. But the greatest danger wasn't the steel. It was what came next. More than 2 million gallons of thick, dark molasses exploded out of the broken tank. Instead of flowing like ordinary water, the heavy syrup formed a massive wave racing through the streets at incredible speed. Some witnesses later described the wall of molasses as being nearly 25 feet high. Within seconds, buildings closest to the tank were completely overwhelmed. Wooden homes splintered apart. Storefronts collapsed. Railway tracks twisted beneath the force of the moving syrup. Everything in its path was swept away. People tried to run, but escaping was far more difficult than anyone could have imagined. Molasses is heavy. It is thick. And as it spread across the freezing streets, it quickly became even stickier. Every step became a struggle. Shoes were pulled into the syrup. People stumbled. Some became trapped before they even realized what was happening. Horse-drawn wagons tipped over. The powerful current carried debris, broken wood, barrels, and pieces of steel through the neighborhood. The streets disappeared beneath a sea of brown. Nearby residents rushed toward windows after hearing the explosion. Many couldn't believe what they were seeing. An entire neighborhood had been transformed into a river of molasses. Police officers, firefighters, and ordinary citizens immediately rushed toward the disaster. At first, many thought it was simply another industrial accident. They had no idea how difficult the rescue would become. Every movement through the thick syrup required enormous effort. Rescuers struggled to reach trapped victims. Ladders became useless. Vehicles couldn't move. Even emergency workers found themselves sinking into the sticky flood. As the afternoon grew colder, the molasses became even thicker. What had already been difficult now became almost impossible. Rescuers used ropes, wooden boards, and anything else they could find to pull survivors to safety. Neighbors risked their own lives to help complete strangers. Some climbed across damaged rooftops. Others formed human chains. The entire community came together in a desperate attempt to save as many people as possible. But with every passing minute, hope began to fade. The disaster had unfolded in less than a minute, yet its consequences would last for generations. And once the rescue teams finally understood the true scale of what had happened, a far more difficult question remained. How could something like this ever have been allowed to happen? The Great Molasses, as daylight slowly faded over Boston, the rescue effort continued without pause. Firefighters, police officers, sailors, doctors, and ordinary citizens worked side by side, refusing to give up on those still trapped beneath the thick layer of molasses and debris. The disaster had lasted only moments, but cleaning up its aftermath would take weeks. Rescue crews searched through collapsed buildings, damaged rail tracks, and shattered wooden structures. The sticky syrup covered everything. Boots became trapped. Tools stopped working. Even horses struggled to move through the hardened molasses. The entire neighborhood had become a nightmare unlike anything rescue workers had ever experienced. As the hours passed, the full scale of the tragedy became clear. 21 people lost their lives. More than 150 others were injured. Families who had started the day expecting an ordinary afternoon suddenly found themselves mourning loved ones. Homes had been destroyed. Businesses had vanished. An entire community had been changed forever. Cleaning the city proved almost as difficult as surviving the flood itself. Thousands of workers spent weeks washing streets, buildings, and harbor docks. Large amounts of seawater were pumped into the area to dilute the thick syrup. Even then, molasses clung stubbornly to brick walls, wooden doors, and metal railings. According to many local accounts, the neighborhood carried the faint smell of molasses for months afterward. As Boston slowly recovered, another question demanded an answer. Why had the tank failed? The United States Industrial Alcohol Company insisted the disaster had been impossible to predict. Some company officials even suggested that unknown saboteurs might have caused the explosion, but investigators weren't convinced. Engineers carefully examined the remains of the tank. Witnesses described years of leaking molasses, strange groaning sounds, and repeated complaints from nearby residents. Evidence showed that the warning signs had been there long before the disaster. The investigation concluded that the tank had likely never been properly tested after construction. Its steel walls were thinner than they should have been for a structure holding such an enormous volume of liquid. Combined with the sudden increase in pressure caused by the newly delivered warm molasses and changing temperatures, the weakened tank finally gave way. The findings transformed the case into one of America's most significant engineering investigations. The legal battle lasted several years. In the end, the court determined that the company was responsible for the disaster. Compensation was awarded to many victims and their families. More importantly, the case helped reshape how large industrial structures would be designed, inspected, and approved in the future. Engineers could no longer rely on assumptions. Careful calculations, independent inspections, and proper safety testing became far more important than ever before. Today, very little remains of the original tank. Visitors walking through Boston's north end might never realize that one of the strangest industrial disasters in American history happened beneath their feet. There is no towering steel tank, no river of molasses, only quiet streets where life has long since returned to normal. Yet the story has never disappeared. It survives in historical records, photographs, eyewitness accounts, and the lessons passed from one generation to the next. The Great Molasses Flood reminds us that disasters do not always arrive in ways we expect. Sometimes they come not from earthquakes, hurricanes, or fires. History is filled with moments that changed the world. Some are remembered because they happened on battlefields, others because they reshaped nations, and some are remembered because, on one cold afternoon in Boston, an entire city learned that even something as ordinary as molasses could become one of history's most unforgettable disasters.